And the lawyer for the plaintiff freely admitted, he said, "Oh, we never thought you did anything wrong. We just wanted to use your testimony as leverage to get the nursing home to settle."
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm Dr. Resa Lewis, emergency medicine and lifestyle medicine physician, medical educator, and your host. This show is about making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jordan Grumet, hospice physician, host of the Earn and Invest podcast, and author of his third book, The Healthcare Heist: How Physicians and Patients Can Unite to Transform Healthcare. Jordan's book is a memoir, storytelling, and a nonfiction reality of the U.S. healthcare system from someone inside of it. Jordan, welcome to the Visible Voices podcast.
Resa, thank you so much for having me.
Your book, it opens with a reveal, and I'll say that reveal is a lawsuit which contributed to aspects of burnout and to a pivot in your clinical career. What made you decide to write about it?
So first and foremost, I remember when I was in residency, I had a friend who was also in residency. She was in OBGYN, and she got named in a suit that she was tangentially related to. And I remember her saying to me, if I end up being found guilty of malpractice, I'm leaving medicine. And I remember how much that hit me. And that was years and years before I faced a process server myself. But it kind of stuck with me. Now, I went through residency, became a physician, dealt with burnout in my own manner, dealing with issues of purpose and why I was doing it. But a sentinel event in my burnout and eventually mostly leaving medicine was I was sitting with my family on a regular Sunday night. The doorbell rings about 8 p.m. I get up, I answer the door, and I get handed a bunch of papers, and it is a lawsuit. I'm being named after, a decade and a half of practicing. The thing I feared finally came true. I didn't remember the patient. I had to look him up. I had no doubt from the first moment that I did nothing wrong. But that ended up being 5 years of my life in which I had to defend myself. I had to deal with lawyers. I had to do depositions. And what really changed for me is they dropped me from the suit at the very end. And the lawyer for the plaintiff freely admitted, he said, "Oh, we never thought you did anything wrong. We just wanted to use your testimony as leverage to get the nursing home to settle," which they eventually did.
You were a pawn. In fact, you talk about pawns and the game of chess. Say a little bit more about that, how it felt.
What hit me at that time is this had changed my whole life. Because like I said, that was a sentinel event. And I was already burning out of medicine. So I decided I was going to leave medicine. Eventually, I left my practice. I left a lot of patients behind. I left a lot of employees behind. I had patients who, after I stopped taking care of them, died within weeks to months afterwards. And I can't help but feel guilty that maybe if I had been there, I would have known something more than their new physician because I had known them for so long. And so the idea really became clear that doctors and patients were pawns in someone else's economic game, right? I was a pawn to this lawyer, but I was also a pawn to the nursing home. And we're all pawns to these third parties who are basically using us to extract wealth. And you start realizing, well, there are all these parties involved in healthcare, and they're not really interested in patient care. Like, your pharmaceutical company, your insurance company, private equity, venture capital, your malpractice lawyer, guess what none of them do? None of them take the Hippocratic Oath. None of them take the Oath of Geneva. They don't have to abide by a standard of care when it comes to patients' well-being. We all do. And when I say we, I'm talking about doctors, but I'm actually also talking about nurses and social workers and chaplains and anyone who touches patient care. No, these entities actually have a fiduciary responsibility, right? And their fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders to extract profits. And the problem is we've now let these third parties practice medicine, right? They're making decisions that actually change our medical care. And they're working off a fiduciary responsibility and not any kind of Hippocratic oath or oath of responsibility to our patients. And we are suffering. And so what we've had is we've had a financialization of our healthcare system, a corporatization of our healthcare system in which the winners ultimately are the people running these companies and the losers ultimately are both doctors and patients.
So how did it feel?
It was crushing. I think our whole system is crushing. And that's the thing, like most patients now go into our system and they feel crushed. They can't find a doctor. Once they find a doctor, they're not sure they're getting the right opinions. They're worried that doctors are making mistakes. Then when the doctor finally orders a test, it's not getting pre-authorized. All sorts of problems are happening. So patients feel crushed. One thing patients don't realize is that their doctors also feel crushed. We're suffering from burnout and moral injury. We see clearly the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to see 2 patients an hour, not 4 patients an hour. But after our practice got bought out by private equity, We're being forced to now see 4 patients an hour. The right thing is to order that medicine. But now that the pharmaceutical company and the insurance company made a deal and they're only covering a different medicine, and that different medicine we know won't work for our patient, we're kind of stuck trying to either get it pre-authorized or trying to give them a secondary medicine we don't think is the right medicine. So patients are feeling crushed, doctors are feeling crushed, but we're not commiserating with each other. We're not bonding together. We're not becoming allies and fighting as the main stakeholders in the system. We're actually getting angry at each other, which is exactly the point of these third parties. We're getting pissed off. We're blaming each other, and they are dividing and conquering, putting their hands in the cookie jar and taking all the money out.
Hence the analogy of being pawns. And in fact, you title your chapter 1, Is Your Doctor Your Frenemy? The Patient's View. So walk us through your vision of the patient's view.
So here's the thing that people don't realize. There are these larger systemic things that have happened to healthcare over the last 30 years have changed how doctors and patients interact. And then there's some smaller things. So let's talk about some of the big trends. The first one is medical malpractice. Back in, I think it was 1997, there was a study by the Institute of Medicine called To Err is Human, and basically said that up to I forget what the number is, 97,000 deaths per year were from errors within the hospital. This was a horrible study. It was over extrapolated. So they took a very few cases of incidents and extrapolated to the whole healthcare system. And just on its nose, it's obvious. If you're going to say that many people die in our healthcare system because of air, what you're really saying is almost 1 in 2 people who die in a hospital are dying from air. And we know that's not true. How do we know that's not true? Because A, it doesn't make sense. The other thing is, if it was true, there should be a lot of malpractice. And here's that malpractice myth. Most people don't realize that 2/3 of cases of medical malpractice are thrown out before they even get to court, where there is no finding gets the doctor. So 67% of cases that are filed are dropped with no finding. Okay, fine. What happens when you get to court? When you get to court, 8 out of 10 cases find for the physician and not the plaintiff. So what we're saying is that of all the cases filed, far less than 10% actually find that there was malpractice. So this whole extrapolation to err is human, it's all false. But if you go look up medical malpractice, put it in your Google browser, you're going to see a bunch of lawyers, and the first thing they mention is to err is human. The second big trend people don't realize actually is managed care. So when insurance changes, remember, managed care is a business solution to making more money. So HMOs, the rise of HMOs, changed things in the sense that they made the primary care doctor the gatekeeper. Now, this is something primary care doctors were never trained to do. We didn't learn it in medical school. Our responsibility, again, is the Hippocratic oath to each and every patient that walks in our door. We do not have an oath to public health that we will provide the most publicly responsible economic care. No, when you walk into the door, I'm going to fight for what I think you need to survive and do well. So this made doctors the arbiter of what should be covered and what shouldn't. They became the gatekeepers. So not only was your doctor willy-nilly making all sorts of mistakes that were killing you, once you went into the office, they were denying you care to pad their own bottom line. And so we have those two big trends. And then the last trend, which people don't really talk about, was government regulation and legislation. Have you ever heard of the Physician Payment Sunshine Act?
Of course.
Physician Payment Sunshine Act, for people who don't know, basically was to expose pharmaceutical payments to doctors. And so what they said is every time a doctor gets a free lunch or gets paid to give a talk or gets paid to be a consultant, it has to be publicly searchable. But here's the problem with that. It actually wasn't to just be about doctors and pharmaceutical companies. It was about to be about doctors, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. And if you look at it, pharmaceutical companies pay on average about $500 per year per physician. Now, for a physician who makes $350,000 or $400,000, $500 in meals and things like that really isn't that much. On the other hand, the pharmaceutical profits are skyrocketing because this is their marketing plan and it's working. So first and foremost, pharmaceutical companies benefit way more than doctors do. The other thing we never talk about is it's actually hospitals that are doing the same thing. No one mentions hospitals. Why did they call the legislation the Physician Payment Sunshine Act? They didn't mention pharmaceutical companies. They didn't mention hospitals. Basically, it's saying physicians did something wrong, when the truth of the matter is it was everyone. But we didn't point at big business. We didn't point at big medicine. We pointed at doctors. So those are the major trends. The legislation, the medical malpractice, and managed care have all really separated doctor and patient.
It is infectious, your enthusiasm for the moral injury of what has happened in healthcare. And what struck me is this blaming of the victim, meaning as if the physician is at fault. But what I really think you put forth is physicians are actually, we've said pawns, but also victims to this system, and we're not necessarily the bad people. There are bad actors in every single industry, but in general, the number of years dedicated to training, the Hippocratic Oath, on, we're not in it for how it's represented.
We have to remember people's intentions because a lot of times we forget. So when you're a patient and you go into the system, your intention is to show up, do your best, and be cared for. And what a lot of people don't realize is your doctor's intention in becoming a doctor was to help people. Like, no one becomes a doctor to make money. It just isn't. Yes, I guess some people become doctors for status, but most people become doctors because A, they were sick as a kid, or a family member was sick as a kid, or they learned how wonderful a profession it was and they really wanted to help people. We all have the same intentions, and yet we're acting as if we're enemies. And that's very helpful to these entrenched third parties in Washington, these corporations that are trying to extract all this money from us, because if they can keep us fighting, we're never going to band together to change things.
One thing I want to say about the Sunshine Act is I saw it change culture. When I was in residency training, it was very common to have pharmaceutical companies donate our textbooks that we got a copy of every year, sponsor our journal club, sponsor lunch at our noon conference. And then over time with the Sunshine Act, that was removed and all this support went away. What I'll say about To Err is Human is one of the positives that did come out of that was the use of safer procedures in the hospital, such as ultrasound-guided central venous line placements.
There is no problem looking at a system that has faults and improving it. But it's a very different thing when you start assigning blame.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think. To Err is Human had good ideas, but it ended up being used as a blame machine. And that's where it went wrong. So yes, improvement in central lines, improvement in infection control, improvement in checklists for surgeries, all of those things are good. There was nothing wrong with the idea behind the study. It was the framing. And this is so often, there's nothing wrong with the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. It's the framing.
Yep.
No one talks about, a lot of times people don't realize, as a medical student, you are groomed by the pharmaceutical company. They are there from day one. The hospitals bring them in. You learn how to talk to pharmaceutical reps from a first-year medical student, and you are progressively groomed. They come in, they make your life better. They bring food when you're starving. They're generally staffed by really attractive young people who pretend to be your friends and who socialize with you and invite you out to social events. And all of it feels very natural and normal. And then you find yourself one day 10, 20 years into it, and they're so integrated in your life, you don't realize, which all sounds horribly negative until you realize that doctors actually don't really benefit that much from the relationship. Most of the benefit is exactly the opposite, which again goes with grooming, right? What do people do when they groom is they pretty much turn you for their benefit. And that's exactly what the pharmaceutical industry has done to our population.
And to be clear, this is why I think it's been a positive cultural change to remove as much influence. It's not gone, but it's more removed than it was. Jordan, 30,000-foot view, who is this book for? Who did you write it for?
I think this is for all of us. Because again, my argument is the main stakeholders in our healthcare system are those who need care and those who are delivering care. And so what I really want to do is bring about that bond between, I call them doctors, but we're really talking about all the caregivers and then all the people who need care. And if we can do that, if we can get main stakeholders together, that's how we change things. That's how life changes when you have entrenched interests that control government. We've seen this over and over again in US as well as world history, that when shared stakeholders come together, they can topple entrenched interests. And I actually don't think we're that far. Believe it or not, I think we're much closer than people realize. But that's why it's for all of us.
One of the premises of this book is that stories and storytelling can help be part of the solution. Go deeper into this thought process.
So we actually see this over and over again in history. When stakeholders come together and share stories, it brings about allyship, and that's when they become too big to be stopped.
What's a healthcare example?
So in the world, we have a great healthcare example in the UK. And so back in the early 1900s, there was a big push for universal healthcare, but they could never get it quite passed. And ultimately, the reason why we think the NHS was passed, I think it was 1940s, early 1950s, was because there was a physician, A.J. Cronin, who wrote a fictional tale called The Citadel, which is all about the atrocities of the healthcare system in the UK at the time. And it's actually been credited, because it was so wide read, of bringing the stakeholders together to push for the legislative change that eventually became the NHS the first major universal healthcare system in the world and one of the biggest. You see, in the UK, every citizen has healthcare. And so we see this over and over again. Shared storytelling changes things.
So, say more about your own practice in palliative care and treating patients at end of life.
I find that that is one of those few places where the combativeness and the disconnect between doctors and patients and caregivers in general and patients doesn't have to be. It's actually the one place where patients can actually feel like those people who show up are there for them. You can see this actually, the corporatization of American healthcare really gets going in the 1950s. But what we also see at that point is doctors and patients' relationships have been changing all these decades. So if you go back to 1900, your doctor lived in your community. You probably went to church with them. Their kids went to your kids' school. If you got sick, they came and visited you in your house. And there was no insurance back then. So, like, if you couldn't pay, maybe you gave them some eggs or some chickens or whatever you did. There was a lot of intimacy between doctors and patients because everyone lived close together and everyone knew each other. Fast forward to now, most patients barely know their doctors. Most patients have to drive to their doctor's office because no one lives in their community anymore. You almost never see your doctor out on the street. You probably don't know their kids. We have now electronic medical records, so we're not even facing a patient anymore. We're looking at a computer. Our visits have shrunk into 5, 10, 15 minutes as opposed to being what they used to be, which was much longer.
I think the electronic health record is a great concrete object that speaks to distance and the change in that relationship. And that's going to bring me forward to AI and the role that AI plays and you predict it will play in creating solution to where we are right now with the healthcare heist.
I think of AI the way I think of electronic medical records. Both of them are great ideas, but the problem is these ideas are being carried out by entrepreneurs who have a fiduciary responsibility and they're selling them to entrepreneurs, right? AI has not been made by physicians who want to give better care so it can be accessible to everyone. AI is made by businesses who want to sell it to the medical system, which means maybe like what happened with electronic medical records. Epic sold systems to 10 different hospitals, but the hospital said, we don't want them to talk to each other because then our patients will move to a different system. So now 10 hospital systems in your area have Epic, but when you go from one hospital to the other, you get in a car accident and they take you to the closest ER. All your medical records are at a different medical system in Epic, but the Epic is not connected to this new Epic and they have no access to your medical system. This is why what we found is electronic medical records. The great hope was it was going to be more efficient, less costly, and you would have less medical errors, better morbidity, better mortality, better care. It never came to fruition. Basically, when you look at all the studies put together, it basically cost us billions. It changed the way doctors see patients. It changed our whole workflow. But the only one walking away happy are the CEOs of the electronic medical record companies because they made billions.
You are giving these strokes of what the reality is of our healthcare system. I'm thinking about some granular examples. I have 2 elder parents. They are in a few different healthcare systems. I literally have 5 tabs of electronic health record portals that I navigate because it's beyond their age to navigate them. Electronic health record, they're like, the what? And to navigate is quite difficult. They don't talk to each other. And so even the primary care physician isn't sure what meds they're on because the cardiologist has just updated their medications.
And what happens? You get stuck out of town and you go to a different hospital system. Then you come back home and get readmitted to your hospital system and you need those records. Well, they have Epic, we have Epic. Why can't we just port it in? We can't. The other place has to print out your records, send them. Then the printed records have to be someone has to actually do the work of sorting through them, figuring out how they fit in the new medical system, scanning them, and then they're not even accessible. Like if you have an X-ray and it was done in your medical system, you can go to the X-ray tab and pull up all the X-rays. But if it was done in another system, it's actually scanned and then put in some kind of documents or attachment folder that isn't related to the X-rays that you can't up and compare them both. Basically, the systems just don't work. It just creates more work for people.
You have decided to use your own stories, your own patient care stories to illustrate your points about the healthcare system. When did you realize you had a voice and when did you start using it?
So I've been a writer all my life. I've always written, even as a little kid. I think when I first started really recognizing my voice, a few things happened at the same time. One is I volunteered for hospice in medical school. And we had a get together for the medical students to learn about different clubs they could join. It was pretty much a club fair. And the hospice people asked me to stand up and say a few things about being a hospice volunteer. And so I got up and talked in front of my whole group of medical students. And I just found I had a knack for telling stories and saying things in such a way to pull at people's heartstrings. Like I could talk about that patient I took care of and what happened in their last moments of life. And this is why you should become a hospice volunteer. At the same time, I, going through medical school and residency, as we all did, experienced just some very difficult, painful, heartbreaking things. And so I had always written poetry, and I started submitting some of my poetry to medical journals. I had a few poems published in Annals of Internal Medicine and Journal of General Internal Medicine. And I realized I put these things out there and I would get letters from people years later saying, I saw your poem in the Annals of Internal Medicine and that really touched me, or that really connected with my experience. And so I started realizing that when we tell stories publicly, whether that be public speaking or podcasting or writing books or blogging, this idea that I can take a few words, juxtaposition them into a blog post or a poem, and I can bring up 1,000 different images in your head. To me, that's the most powerful thing. And so I learned at that point that I can use my voice, and it's a very powerful thing to do.
It's a powerful thing. And I would add it's courageous and it's brave. The stories you share, I could see other healthcare professionals, other physicians being like, I'm not going to write about that. That's vulnerable. That's going to get me in trouble. Colleagues may question my medical care. How did you come to peace and rationalize, no, these are important stories. I'm going to write them?
Well, it's the other way around. It's because they're vulnerable and difficult that we need to tell them on some level. This is how we get past that intimacy gap between doctors and patients, and even doctors and other doctors. The problem is, and I've talked about this a lot in the book, patients bear everything to us. They come in, they tell us all the problems, and then they literally take off their clothes in front of us. And so when someone like me goes out and writes about what it feels like to be a doctor and a patient reads it, they can say something to the extent of, wow, I never knew my doctor went through that. And that to me is a breakthrough. That's where we start bringing back the intimacy to the doctor-patient relationship, because without having that intimacy, there's no way we come together to fix this broken.
So thread that needle. How will this help fix the broken system?
It already is, right? If you ever watch the TV show The Pit, I don't watch it. It would cause me way too much PTSD. But The Pit is a perfect example in which we have storytelling around what it feels like to be in our medical system from the caregiver side. But not only that, Noah Wyle, who's the producer and main actor, goes to Washington and helps lobby for legislation, pro-caregiver legislation. It's through things like this that we actually get change. And if you think we're far away, we were perilously close with Obamacare. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. The fact is, Obamacare was really our first attempt at revolutionizing our healthcare system. It fell short. But when you look at the political upheaval we're facing right now, and again, I talk about this a lot and I don't want to get overtly political, but I think it's worth saying. When you look, for instance, at all these elections where Democrats, socialists are winning primaries, that is a group of young people who are fighting for things like universal healthcare. You can agree or disagree, that's up to you. But the fact is, people are getting angry and they're telling their stories and they're trying to bind together. I don't think we're that far.
Yeah.
The solutions have to occur. When you look at other countries, most countries spend about $7,000 per person per year in healthcare. In the United States, we spend about $13,000 or $14,000. Here's the crazy thing. In most of those countries, they get charged extra taxes. They pay those taxes, accept them, and then they get all the healthcare they need. Healthcare doesn't bankrupt anyone. People get pretty much the same quality of care they get here. Here, we say it's too much for us to pay taxes, and then we pay $35,000, $36,000 worth of premiums and copays and all that kind of stuff. We are woefully overpaying for our care. We're paying way more than $13,000, which is hefty as it is, and we're paying way more than the $7,000, which is what it costs in other countries. In other words, every person in the United States is already paying for universal health care. You're just not getting it.
Stories are going to fix it. When you shared about The Pit, I've had so many people reach out and say, I finally understand what you do and what ultrasound is because they see it at The Pit. It definitely has brought people together, and it's created understanding, certainly, of emergency medicine and physician burnout, struggles, moral injury, etc. Jordan, why do you think we as physicians do need to speak up and combat disinformation and correct inaccuracies of misinformation?
I think that's the only way we're ever going to come together to fix this system. So you were talking about the fact that people watch The Pit and they understand what you do better. We as physicians do a great job of telling people what we know. Like we're really good at telling you how to avoid heart disease and how to get your cholesterol in shape and all that. But we're really bad at telling people who we are. And I think that's really important if we want to fix this system. The only way things are going to get better is once we start telling people who we are, what our vulnerabilities are, what our intentions are. I think that's when we're finally going to get the cohesion we need to truly change things.
I'd love to leave the audience with micro skills, small intentional actions they can take when they complete our episode. So let's start with the doctors and other healthcare professionals, those that want to take a stab at telling their story to create change, to heal the broken healthcare system. What's one small action they can take?
My God, there's so many. I mean, there's so many ways to express yourself nowadays. I started by submitting poems to Annals of Internal Medicine. You might start a blog, a podcast. You might just make, I see so many people on Facebook who see something go wrong in the world and they just comment. They just say, hey, I'm a pediatrician. And so here's what I think about this new mandate and why it works and why it doesn't work. The idea is that we have to be not afraid to get out there and use our voices.
For the people listening who actually are struggling with the healthcare system, navigating it, maybe getting a second opinion, maybe even getting an established primary care physician, what's one small step they can take?
I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to tell you some really easy things every one of us can do to get third parties out of our healthcare system. So first and foremost, ask for generic medicines. If you go to the doctor and you're having your blood pressure, cholesterol treated, there's so many great generic medicines. Every time we use a generic, less profits go to pharmaceutical companies. If you have a test or a medicine and the insurance company denies you, appeal it. Like appeal over and over and over again. Every time we appeal, it basically says to them, we will not take this. If you have the choice, do some research on primary care doctors and find a primary care doctor who's not owned by venture capital or private equity. Like find a practice. And if you have to, if you're willing to pay a little extra, go do concierge medicine or direct primary care. But there are all ways in which basically doctors are stepping out of the system. They're saying insurance, no way. Every time we do these things, we're helping take a little bit of money out of the pockets of these third parties and keep it in our own.
Some of the actions that you are pointing to cost. They either cost literally money or they cost time, like to appeal. So how do you rectify that time or money cost?
You can't afford money, use time. And if you can afford money, use money. But ultimately, the benefit far outweighs the risk. For whatever little extra money you're going to pay or for whatever extra time you put into it, the other side is universal health care that doesn't bankrupt anyone and that covers most of the care. And even if we don't get to universal health care, if we can get to a place where most of the healthcare dollars stay in healthcare and aren't extracted by these third parties, we're going to get a better quality of care either way, and it's going to affect all of us.
Jordan, for listeners and viewers that want to keep following you and your work, what's the best way?
Easiest way to go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET. There you can see all three of my books, Taking Stock, The Purpose Code, The Healthcare Heist, as well as all the places I create content, including the Earn and Invest podcast and the Purpose Code Substack. It's all at jordangrumet.com.
Jordan Grumet, thank you so much for joining me on the Visible Voices podcast.
Thank you for having me.
The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and innovation spaces. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Find me at Resa E. Lewis MD on social media or visit thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and watch our episodes on YouTube. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and guests are their own and do not reflect those of their employers or institutions. Guest appearances do not imply endorsement of any product, service, or organization. Information shared here is intended for general informational purposes only, reflects the time of recording, and should never substitute for clinical judgment or individualized medical advice. No physician-patient relationship is created by listening to or watching this podcast. Together, we're making healthcare more equitable, one visible voice at a time.